we go. The first question, of course, is, we look at this and we say to ourselves, my gosh, how could this possibly happen? Right? We see this back in the early part of the chapter, right? The dragon gave it his power, his throne, and complete authority. This is what he gives to the beast. Now, we could look at this and we could say, well, it's almost hard for us to imagine a time when everybody in the world is going to flock to one governmental system and, embrace it, I guess is the best way to put it. It's not only just accepting it, it's almost like they're begging for it. When I originally wrote this, it probably looked a lot less plausible than it does now. Post-COVID, it takes on a whole new feel because we saw just how quickly almost the entire world fell into lockstep with everything that the various governments around the world imposed on these people. And not only did they fall into it lockstep, some people still can't let go of it. As we've talked about and as we all witness occasionally. So it's not like it's just going to spring up overnight, right? We're going to look at the possibility that some of this stuff has been in the works for quite a long time, right? The prince of this world has been moving pieces around the board. Of course, that's Satan, and he's been waiting for this time. He knows that his moment is coming, so it hasn't been like he hasn't been putting the work in. This is stuff that's kind of been going on in the background, and as we go about our daily business, we probably don't notice this too much. I would venture a guess that more people are paying attention to such things now than they ever did in the past. And all I'll say is, even though we see some things that are comforting in the events that have transpired here in the last 6, 7 months, in the same way, I would also say this, and I've said it before, don't get too comfortable. Because in some respects, this is almost kind of like the lull before the storm, if you ask me. So again, I'm going to dig into this. There's a guy by the name of Dennis Cuddy. He's a very well-versed historian and a political analyst. And he says this regarding world government. He says the term New World Order has been used thousands of times in this century by proponents in high places of federalized world government. For years, leaders in education, industry, the media, banking, etc., have promoted those with the same worldview as theirs. Of course, someone might say that just because individuals promote their friends doesn't constitute a conspiracy. That's true in the usual sense. However, it does represent an open conspiracy as described by noted Fabian socialist H.G. Wells in The Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution, which was written in 1928. Okay, there's a lot of stuff that you probably have never heard of, or if you have, you probably didn't give it much due. We get caught up in our day-to-day stuff, and it's hard to reconcile some of this stuff. It does take some effort to actually pay attention to the things that are going on. So we're going to get a little bit of a timeline of this movement, and I went back when I first did this. It was about 100 years. Now it's been more like 112 years, of course, but you're going to get a flavor for this. And there's probably a lot of stuff that's happened since, and I collect a lot of things. One of these days, I'm going to add to this study. I'll probably end up being a two-parter, but as it stands right now, I'm going to do this all in one shot, and I will be paying for it later. But that's okay, because basically I am just going to read for an hour. So, for what it's worth. So this goes back to 1913. The president at the time was Woodrow Wilson, and he had this to say. Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the U.S. in the field of commerce and manufacturing are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Right? This is the President of the United States. You would think that the president wouldn't be afraid to say anything, right? Well, guess again. 1913, the Federal Reserve, it's neither federal nor a reserve, is created. It was planned at a secret meeting in 1910 on Jekyll Island, Georgia, by a group of bankers and politicians. This transferred the power to create money from the American government to a private group of bankers. It is probably the largest generator of debt in the world. That's exactly what it does. And just like we saw with the last administration, when the debt started escalating, what did they do? They just kept printing more and more money. that caused inflation to go through the roof, and that causes our national debt to go through the roof. Every dollar they print, there's 5% interest on it. So for every dollar that's in circulation in our country, our government's paying $1.05 for it. Think about that. We are in perpetual debt to a World Bank, right? Debt is bad. And when you are in debt, the person who holds the note has control.
And the Federal Reserve controls the interest rates, which goes to debt.
Absolutely. Right. See, I knew you were going to like this session. Right. So that's the first thing. So you see, all of a sudden, right out of the gates, 1913, bad. May 30th, 1919. Prominent British and American personalities established the Royal Institute of International Affairs in England and the Institute of International Affairs in the US at a meeting attended by various Fabian socialists, including noted economist John Maynard Keynes. 2 years later, the Institute of International Affairs is renamed the Council on Foreign Relations. That's a name we're probably more familiar with now than the previous. Just for the record, the Fabian Socialist Society, I've mentioned them a couple of times already, is a British socialist organization whose purpose is to advance the principles of socialism via gradualist and reformist rather than revolutionary means. In other words, slowly, over time. It's the frog in the hot plate kind of thing, right? Immediately upon its inception, the Fabian Society began attracting many prominent contemporary figures drawn to its socialist cause, including George Bernard Shaw, famous atheist, H.G. Wells, Annie Besant, well, she's a heretic, Hubert Bland, Edith Nesbit, Leonard and Virginia Woolf, and Bertrand Russell. He's another, anti-Christian kind of guy too. Actually, pretty much all of them. So we fast forward a little bit just to get an idea. We're going to see there's various groups here that are kind of, again, interlocked, so to speak. December 15th, 1922, the Council on Foreign Relations endorses world government in its magazine Foreign Affairs. Author Philip Kerr states, obviously, there is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind as long as the earth remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states until some kind of international system is created. The real problem today is that of the world government, right? 1922. Now, what was just introduced prior to 1922 that got rejected by the United States? Because the people back then were intelligent and they actually saw that there was a problem with the League of Nations, right? So this is just on the heels of some of that, but this is where it's going. And you see that the biggest thing that they're trying to push here is this socialist thing. And they talk about, well, you can't have prosperity and you can't have, all this other stuff, right? You can't have peace, right? Because there's too many different countries and there's too many things going on, too many independent states. I think we recognize that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that being said, if you put all that power in somebody's hands, there will be no peace, not the kind that they're purporting. And there will be no safety, and there will be no prosperity. They will take, exactly, right? And they will take people down to the lowest common denominator. They won't bring people up, they'll be bringing them down. 1928, The Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution by H.G. Wells is published. Wells writes, the political world of the open conspiracy must weaken, efface, incorporate, and supersede existing governments. The open conspiracy is the natural inheritor of socialist and communist enthusiasms. It may be in control of Moscow before it is in control of New York. The character of the open conspiracy will now be plainly displayed. It will be a world religion. In 1931, in a speech, historian Arnold Toyer said, we are at present working discreetly with all our might to wrest this mysterious force called sovereignty out of the clutches of the local nation states of the world. All the time we are denying with our lips what we are doing with our hands. This has been going on for a while. And I'll say this, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, that they were cruising along. They were chipping away at this. They had a nice little progression going all the way through Obama's second administration. And when Trump came along, he threw a monkey wrench into the works big time. And I told my wife after that, I said, if he didn't get reelected in 2020, I said, you watch. I said, this will not be a slow process. They will kick it into high gear, and they did. You know, I am not a prophet. I'm just paying attention. And I was right, because they escalated big time. But I think enough people got to the point where they said enough is enough. Even the supporters that were going in that direction said, you know, this isn't good. And I think that kind of pushed where we actually had real elections this time instead of the farce that happened in 2020. That being said, 1933, the first Humanist Manifesto was published. Co-author John Dewey. Does that name sound familiar to you? Yeah, who's John Dewey, just for the record? He was the guy who invented the Dewey Decimal System, right? Right? Yeah, see, this is how they got infiltrated into education going back into the 30s, right? The noted educator calls for a synthesizing of all religions and a socialized and cooperative economic order. Do you start to see a theme developing here? Co-signer C.F. Potter said this in 1930, education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every American public school is a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday schools meeting for an hour once a week, teaching only a fraction of the children, do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? 1930, by the way, right? This is when they started talking about getting prayer out of school. That was the humanists. And Trump, to his credit, is trying to get rid of the Board of Education, the national education system, and put it back in the hands of the states, because now they'll be accountable to people. Right now, they're not accountable to anybody. So this is where it was going, and this is why it went there. Hindsight's 20/20, isn't it? 1934, The Externalization of the Hierarchy by Alice A. Bailey is published. Bailey is an occultist whose works are channeled from a spirit guide, the demon spirit Jawal Kul. Bailey uses the phrase points of light in connection with a new group of world servers and claims that 1934 marks the beginning of the organizing of the men and women group work of a new world order, the world of the brotherhood, the forces of light, and out of the spoliation of all existing culture and civilization, the new world order must be built. Right? Tear everything down and rebuild it in their own image. Well, in somebody's image. The book is published by the Lucis Trust, incorporated originally in New York as the Lucifer Publishing Company. They had to change the name because it was a little over the top. That's who Alice Bailey worships. Trust me.
Oh, that's why that sounded familiar.
Right. Lucis Trust is a United Nations NGO and has been a major player at the recent UN summits. Right. Later, Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Robert Mueller, would credit the creation of his World Core curriculum for education to the underlying teachings of Jawal Kul via Alice Bailey's writings on the subject. There we go. Again, who supplies most of the curriculums for our schools today? United Nations. And it comes from an occult influence. What do you think they're teaching your kids in school? Why do you think they have kids that are going to the bathroom in sandboxes? Because this is the outpouring of this kind of stuff, and it's been going on now for almost 100 years. 1932, The Plan for Peace by American Birth Control League founder Margaret Sanger is published. She calls for coercive sterilization, mandatory segregation, and rehabilitative concentration camps for all dysgenic stocks, including Blacks, Hispanics, American Indians, and Catholics. She was a big influence on Hitler.
Between like the 1900s and the 1940s, that people got so evil.
Well, no, they were before. It's just now they just started coming together and saying, hey, if we plan this out, we can do this. You could probably make a case some of this stuff was going on even pre-Revolutionary War in our country. Because a lot of this stuff was going on in Europe for a long, long time. You want to know why Europe is such a mess? They've been having this stuff going on for about 300-400 years or more. 1939, New World Order by H.G. Wells proposes a collectivist one world state or New World Order comprised of socialist democracies. More socialist than democracy, trust me. He advocates universal conscription for service and declares that nationalist individualism is the world's disease. Why do you think they started pushing, it was a slur to call somebody a nationalist here recently? And why do you think they attached Christian to that? Right? You can start to see why. All right, he continues, the manifest necessity for some collective world control to eliminate warfare and the less generally admitted necessity for a collective control of the economic and biological life of mankind. That's what they call vaccines, folks. Or aspects of one and the same process. He proposes that this be accomplished through universal law and propaganda or education. See, you're not educating kids now. You're indoctrinating kids. So it's not education anymore, it's propaganda. Imagine that. 1940, the New World Order is published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and contains a select list of references on regional and world federation, together with some special plans for world after the war. That's in 1940, so they're in the throes of World War II, and they're already talking about how they're going to reorder things afterwards. 1942, the Leftist Institute of Pacific Relations prints Post-War Worlds by P.E. Corbett. World government is the ultimate aim. It must be recognized that the law of nations takes precedence over national law. The process will have to be assisted by the deletion of the nationalistic material employed in educational textbooks and its replacement by material explaining the benefits of wiser association. Not education, indoctrination. But you see, they want to do away with nations. I saw a post today where they were talking about the economics of things. Somebody put on there, okay, maybe I don't get it. Why would the last administration do everything they can to collapse the country? This is why. This has been the goal. They want to do away with a sovereign United States, and you can't have a sovereign United States if you want to put into effect world government.
Hence open borders.
And open borders. Can you see how all this stuff, this is not accidental. You know what I mean? It's really not. And this is just the way they affected it, because it was happening all across Europe too. June 28, 1945. President Truman states it will be just as easy for nations to get along in a republic of the world as it is for us to get along in a republic of the United States. Yeah, he was pretty much a traitor too. October 24th, 1945, the United Nations Charter becomes effective. Also on October 24th, Senator Glenn Taylor, Democrat, Idaho, indicates Senate Resolution 183, or introduces Senate Resolution 183, calling upon the U.S. Senate to go on record as favoring creation of a world republic, including an international police force. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is what they've been pushing for. This was post World War II, right? And of course, they rejected the League of Nations, but now they get 30 years later and they welcome that. They welcome the United Nations. 1946, The Teacher and World Government by former editor of the National Education Association Journal, Joy Elmer Morgan, is published. He says, in the struggle to establish an adequate world government, the teacher can do much to prepare the hearts and minds of children for global understanding and cooperation. At the very heart of all the agencies which will assure the coming of world government must stand the school, the teacher, and the organized profession. So you wonder why you have your schools filled with rainbow flags and stuff like that, and all the stuff that they're teaching them. And all of a sudden, you can't go home and tell your parents if Johnny decides he wants to be Janie now. And who planted that idea in Johnny's head? Well, I'm sure one of those teachers did. And this is what happens. They pump this stuff into kids' heads. They have them all screwed up. You get them all doped up. You get them all, heavy dosed with vaccines, and half of them are on the spectrum now. So you have kids that are more pliable. They're easier to control. They're not quite as bright as their predecessors. So they just do as they're told.
Greatest psyop ever.
Yep.
Call a bad bug, make everybody sit at home for months on end watching TV, and we will program you.
Absolutely. Or deprogram you. So this is what happens. None of this was accidental. None of this. 1947, the American Education Fellowship, formerly the Progressive Education Association, organized by John Dewey, calls for the establishment of a genuine world order, an order in which national sovereignty is subordinate to world authority. So when we just did the last segment, do you remember the part where it says, there'll be basically 10 world leaders under the guise of the Antichrist or anything like that? This is how you make it subordinate to world authority. October 1947, NEA Associate Secretary William Carr writes in the NEA Journal that teachers should teach about the various proposals that have been made for the strengthening of the United Nations and the establishment of a world citizenship and world government. Do you see now why Trump is throwing a monkey wrench into everything? He's going the complete opposite direction with this. 1948, Walden 2 by behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner proposes a perfect society or new and more perfect order in which children are reared by the state rather than by their parents and are trained from birth to demonstrate only desirable behavior and characteristics. So that rules out toxic masculinity, by the way. Skinner's ideas would be widely implemented by educators in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as values clarification and outcome-based education. Do you remember that one? 1948, UNESCO president and Fabian socialist Sir Julian Huxley calls for a radical eugenic policy in UNESCO. Its purpose and its philosophy, he states. Thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy of controlled human breeding will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, that much that is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable. Why do you think you see this overarching push worldwide for abortion? And they have managed to convince people that this is a good way to go because they have pushed this idea that basically, having unfettered sexual relations with everybody and anybody is the only freedom that you should be desiring. I don't watch many commercials, and I haven't watched an NFL game in probably 8, 9 years, but the bottom line is when I used to watch them, and if I did get stuck watching the commercials, every other commercial was a Viagra or Cialis commercial. Or the O-ring, or whatever else they were throwing in there that had to do with the ability to promote open sexuality among all people. Not only is it goes directly against everything that the Bible says, which I think is part of the background of a lot of this stuff, but the idea is if you're so completely caught up in this, and all the time, hey, all it takes is a couple of people that are really fertile to start cranking out kids. Well, now they start cranking out abortions. That's how you control human breeding. One way. And of course, Bill Gates is on the record for saying that you can do that through vaccines.
Mhm.
There's no better way to promote that stuff than have people beg for it. And they've managed to convince too many people to beg for it. 1948, the preliminary draft of a world constitution is published by U.S. educators advocating regional federation on the way toward world federation or government, with England incorporated into a European federation. 1948. This is the earliest stages of the European Union. The Constitution provides for a World Council along with a Chamber of Guardians to enforce world law. Also included is a preamble calling upon nations to surrender their arms to the world government, and includes the right of this Federal Republic of the world to seize private property for federal use. Remember when they started that a few years ago, where they came out, they were going to do eminent domain, and they were going to start saying, well, we might have to take your property because it might be better for the community if there's a park where your house is sitting. They started that crap. Yeah, they started that crap a little while ago, but they started to push it. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is they'll say something like that, and it's so over the top, and people will react, and they'll react badly. but it's like they take 3 steps forward, but they only take 2 steps back. And then little by little, they start working into it. And little by little, they chip away, which is what we've been seeing now for 100 years or more. The Constitution, oh, I already did that. February 9th, 1950, the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee introduces Senate Concurrent Resolution 66, which begins, whereas in order to achieve universal peace and justice, the present charter of the United Nations should be changed to provide a true world government constitution. Senator Alex Wiley, Republican, Wisconsin, called it a consummation devoutly to be wished for, and said, I understand your proposition is either change the United Nations or change or create by a separate convention a world order. Senator Taylor later stated, we would have to sacrifice considerable sovereignty to the World Organization to enable them to levy taxes in their own right to support themselves. Clinton signed off on a whole bunch of that stuff by executive order with Agenda 21 way back in the mid-1990s. 1950, in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, international financier James P. Warburg said, we shall have a world government whether or not we like it. The question is only whether world government will be achieved by consent or by conquest. They're going to do it, well, this is their plan. They're going to do it one way or another. And these people are still out there. These people have drunk the Kool-Aid. And there's still plenty of them out there. Right now, they're just, they're kind of regrouping. April 12, 1952, John Foster Dulles, later to become Secretary of State, says in a speech to the American Bar Association in Louisville, Kentucky, that treaty laws can override the Constitution. He says treaties can take power away from Congress and give them to the president. They can take powers from the states and give them to the federal government or to some international body. And they can cut across the rights given to the people by the Constitutional Bill of Rights. Our last president kept saying over and over again that those amendments in your Constitution are not absolutes. That's where it comes from. A Senate amendment proposed by GOP Senator John Bricker would have provided that no treaty could supersede the Constitution, but it fails to pass by one vote. If it wasn't so much earlier, it would have sworn Kamala Harris provided the vote. 1954, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands establishes the Bilderbergers, international politicians and bankers who meet secretly on an annual basis. 1958, World Peace Through World Law is published, where authors Grenville Clark and Louis Sohn advocate using the UN as a governing body for the world, world disarmament, a world police force, and legislature. We see another theme developing. I know, it helps when I highlight them. 1959, the Council on Foreign Relations calls for a new international order study, number 7, issued on November 25th, advocated new international order that must be responsive to world aspirations for peace, for social and economic change, an international order including states labeling themselves as socialist/communist. Wow. When I was growing up, all I kept hearing was that communism was bad, right? In the background, these guys have been promoting it now for the last 70, 80 years. 1959, the Mid-Century Challenge to U.S. Foreign Policy is published, sponsored by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. It explains that the U.S. cannot escape and indeed should welcome the task which history has imposed on us. This is the task of helping to shape a new world order in all its dimensions: spiritual, economic, political, social. You see a couple of trends that come up through this as they're speaking about world government. One is the disarmament, right? That's obvious because, let's face it, they recognize the biggest armed force in this world is the United States. And that's just the civilians, right? They know that. That's why this push to have guns taken away is not just the product of, the socialist Democrats. This is a world push because they want to take guns out of your hands. Why do you think the founders of our country put it in there? The Second Amendment was critical because it wasn't so much worried about foreign people coming in here and taking over your country. They were more concerned about internally what could happen. That's the point of it. And every time I do this, I know one of these days somebody's going to come and whisk me away. So we move into the 60s. This is all of our lifetime now, right? We're starting to get into that, although you were a little, yeah, you were a little after that. You whippersnapper. 1961, the U.S. State Department issues a plan to disarm all nations and arm the United Nations. Oh my gosh. State Department docket number 7277 is entitled Freedom from War, the U.S. Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. It details a three-stage plan to disarm all nations and arm the UN, with the final stage in which no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Oh my gosh. That just gives me a nightmare thinking about it. March 1st, 1962, Senator Clark speaking to the Senate about PL 87-297, which calls for the disbanding of all armed forces and the prohibition of their reestablishment in any form whatsoever. This program is the fixed, determined, and approved policy of the government of the United States. 1962. 1963, J. William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, speaks at a symposium sponsored by the Fund for the Republic, a left-wing project of the Ford Foundation. Have you noticed these foundations keep popping up in here? The case for government by elites is irrefutable. Government by the people is possibly but highly improbable. And, you know, there was a, what's his name? He ran for president against Bush Carrick. You know, he's still involved in all this stuff and everything like that. And he just came out and he was basically making a speech along the lines of, you know, we have to, it's good that there's people like us out here that are, you know, able to make decisions for everybody, you know, because we're basically uniquely qualified to do that. I don't know who qualified him, because I think he's, you know, he's kind of frightening in some respects, but he's not, you know, he's not as qualified as he thinks he is. 1964 Taxonomy of Educational Objectives Handbook is published by author Benjamin Bloom. He says a large part of what we call good teaching is the teacher's ability to attain effective objectives through challenging the student's fixed beliefs. Where do students get fixed beliefs? Oh, yep. Right, so that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be change agents and start, you know, changing your kids, because let's face it, when kids are young, you know, that's when they absorb everything. So why do you think they start with them now when they're 5 or 6 years old? I mean, why do you think they start sex education as early as they can? Because they can be very influential. By the time most kids get to be 16, 17 years old, they're a little bit more stubborn and a little bit more rebellious and not so quick to adapt all this stuff. So they start integrating early and indoctrinating and influencing. His outcome-based education, OBE, method of teaching would first be tried as mastery learning in Chicago schools. After 5 years, Chicago students' test scores had plummeted, causing outrage among parents. OBE would leave a trail of wreckage wherever it would be tried and under whatever name it would be used. At the same time, it would become crucial to globalists for overhauling the education system to promote attitude changes among the students. That's why they're doing away with the Department of Education, because anybody that's been paying attention sees what they've been doing now for a long, long time. And it was never supposed to be this. 1964, Visions of Order by Richard Weaver is published. He says, progressive educators as a revolutionary cabal engaged in a systematic attempt to undermine society's traditions and beliefs. What kind of beliefs do you think that they want to do away with? Yeah, just a guess. You know, probably those that have to do with Jesus Christ. 1967, Richard Nixon calls for a new world order in Asia after Vietnam. In the October issue of Foreign Affairs, Nixon writes of nations' dispositions to evolve regional approaches to developmental needs, and to the evolution of a new world order. Yeah, he was in on it too. July 26, 1968, Nelson Rockefeller pledges support of the New World Order. In an Associated Press report, Rockefeller pledges that as president, he would work toward international creation of a new world order. At this period of time, they were way over the top with it, and nobody was paying attention, and I still think that probably all of the upheaval that we saw in this country between the 60s and the early 70s was designed on purpose. Because when you have all this going on, who the heck was paying attention to anything any of these guys said?
We had 3 channels.
Right, and they were doing it right out in the open. 1970, education and the mass media promote world order. In thinking about a new world order for the decade 1990, author Ian Baldwin Jr. asserts that the World Law Fund has begun a worldwide research and educational program that will introduce a new emerging discipline world order into educational curricula throughout the world, and to concentrate some of its energies on bringing basic world order concepts into the mass media again on a worldwide level. So basically, it's not just, concepts, it's propaganda. And once again, education, education, education. They're going to start to do it with the kids. And they become expert at getting kids to disassociate with their families. When you tell a kid, listen, Johnny, we're going to, we know that you really, think that you're a girl, so we're going to help you with this, but don't tell your parents. Because your parents, they don't like you like we do. They make parents enemies. And the worst part about it is too many young parents have bought into this nonsense.
My daughter.
Or they go to jail.
Or they go to jail. When you have parents go to the school board meeting and they stress their concerns and they are called, basically domestic terrorists because they disagree with the direction their kids are being taken, you have a problem. This goes back to, of course, the Homeland Security Act, which started back in 2001, of course. And I said it when they put it into effect that this was bad, and I was right. And it went dormant until COVID and all this stuff started. Right? Nobody heard anything about it for 20 years. And then when they pulled the cover off of it, see, it's been in place for 20 years. What's the big deal? We're just enforcing the law. Who else said that? Everybody who was tried at Nuremberg said that. If you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. May 18, 1972, and speaking of the coming world government, Roy M. Ash, director of the Office of Management and Budget, declares that within 2 decades, the institutional framework for a world economic community will be in place, and aspects of individual sovereignty will be given over to a supernatural authority. That's not Superman. This is, yeah. Have we gotten to when you were born yet?
No. Just about. Let's throw 4 more years.
Reagan kind of screwed it up, though.
For a little while, yeah, but he kind of caved after the assassination attempt. Humanist Manifesto 2 is published. Remember, the first one was back in the 30s. The next century can and should be the humanistic century. We stand at the dawn of a new age, a secular society on a planetary scale. As non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. We deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. Thus, we look to the development of a system of world law and world order based on transnational federal government. The true revolution is occurring. This is 50 years ago. 1973, the Trilateral Commission is established. Banker David Rockefeller organizes this new private body and chooses Zbigniew Brzezinski, later National Security Advisor to President Carter, as the commission's first director, and invites Jimmy Carter to become a founding member.
Hence the collapse of our society.
Right. Well, Carter was ushered in by Brzezinski, and they did the same thing with Clinton. He was behind that because it was a method, and he worked it. And yeah, Reagan kind of threw a monkey wrench into that for a little bit of time too. But Bush 1 didn't, because he was on board from the beginning. 1974, the World Conference of Religion for Peace, held in Louvain, Belgium, is held. Douglas Roche presents a report entitled, "We Can Achieve a New World Order." There's another theme. See, they want to get that religion thing in there because here's something that they understand, that people have spiritual needs, and there's a spiritual side to people. So they're going to do away with the stuff that doesn't suit their needs. The problem with Christianity is its exclusivity, right? Christ is the only way. It's the one way. And you know, we saw it during COVID. The only people that stand between this kind of stuff and the whole world collapsing is the church, the true church, not this gobbledygook you see in some of these denominations. But you know, here's the bottom line. They know they need that kind of influence because that's the kind of stuff people will respond to. But false religion will fit in there just as nicely if they can get people indoctrinated into it early, like in the schools. Imagine that. Why do you think in some of the schools, and I have the article somewhere, that they were teaching them about, in California, about Aztec gods and stuff like that, or walking them through Islamic rituals in the schools so they would be familiar with Islam and everything like that. You know, believe me, Islam is not a true religion. And, you know, it's actually a very hot mess when you get right down to it. But at the end of the day, you know, it's an oppressive religion. And if you can get people indoctrinated into that, then you have the boot on their neck already.
Yeah.
Why do you think that some of these places aren't kicking them out?
There's a reason.
Trust me. 1975, in Congress, 32 senators and 92 representatives signed a Declaration of Interdependence written by historian Henry Steele Commager. The declaration states that we must join with others to bring forth a new world order. Narrow notions of national sovereignty must not be permitted to curtail that obligation. This is the idea of breaking down the sovereignty of nations. And we've been witnessing that. Congresswoman Marjorie Holt refuses to sign the declaration, saying, I like her already, it calls for the surrender of our national sovereignty to international organizations. It declares that our economy should be regulated by international authorities. It proposes that we enter a new world order that would redistribute the wealth created by the American people. That's where all the money's been going. And who's got into that hot and heavy? Obama. Among others, but he definitely took it to a new level. 1975, Kissinger on the Couch is published. Authors Phyllis Schlafly and former CFR member Chester Ward state, once the ruling members of the CFR have decided that the U.S. government should espouse a particular policy, the very substantial research facilities of the CFR are put to work to develop arguments, intellectual and emotional, which is interesting, to support the new policy and to confound, discredit intellectually and politically any opposition. So they have very well-ordered arguments. They might be absolutely false, but they're well-ordered and they sound really good. And here's the thing that I find interesting about that. It's one thing to develop intellectual arguments, because there's a lot of intellectuals out there who are lunatics, right? But here's the other part. They appeal to emotions. They get people upset, right? We just witnessed this. I keep referring to COVID because I didn't have this then when I originally put this together. But think about it. They scared people to death. And what we saw was an emotional response. And people were afraid. They were not only afraid of getting this disease, which was going to kill half the known world, but they were also afraid of what would happen if they went outside without a mask because their neighbors were turning them in. Same kind of crap that happened in Nazi Germany and other places. This is the kind of stuff that's been going on forever. And unfortunately, when you play on people's emotions, boy, you can manipulate them in ways that are unimaginable. 1977, the Third Triad World Order is published. Author Harlan Cleveland of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies calls for changing Americans' attitudes and institutions for complete disarmament, except for international soldiers, and for individual entitlement to food, health, and education. This is what all this equity talk is about. That's what redistribution is. That's what changes individual entitlement to food, health, and education. The woman who was in charge of the health program in California during COVID, she's not a doctor, but she came out that we have to get away from treatment-based healthcare to equity-based healthcare. So it's not a matter of, hey, you need to go to the hospital, or I need to go to the hospital to be treated. Well, we can't treat you because it's not equitable. You know, we've treated too many of this group, so we have to treat more of this group. So, you know, basically you're out of luck. That's what this starts looking like.
Individual entitlement to food, health, and education. Next thing you know, you had local government saying you can't plant a garden where you live.
They started that.
You're not allowed to have chickens.
Right, and they did away with, what do they call those seeds? Heirloom seeds, right? So, you know, Monsanto basically controls just about all that stuff, and none of those things can reproduce. You know, which is great for your profit margin, but it's a disaster. I still think that when we started this in the early going and we saw when we're going to have famines and stuff like that, I truly believe that the famines are going to be a result of that because they won't have plants that are able to reproduce viable seeds. They've been neutered, so to speak. And that being said, you know, there's going to come a time where if the factory's not working, you can't get the seeds, and then we're all in trouble. So I said, I've had a good run. I'm an old fart. And you know what? Whatever happens, happens. But I worry for the younger people in my family that I care about. This is what it's been going through. This is not new. 1979, Barry Goldwater, rep senator from Arizona, publishes his autobiography with no apologies. He writes that, in my view, the Trilateral Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the four centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. See that theme developing still? In the interest of creating a more peaceful and productive world community. What the trilateralists intend is a creation of a worldwide economic power superior to the governments of the nation states involved. They believe that the abundant materialism they propose to create will overwhelm existing differences. They will rule the future. But what they don't tell you is that the materialism is one thing, but it's not going to be abundant materialism. It's going to be scaled down materialism. If you are middle class, you won't be middle class anymore. There will be a handful of people at the very top of this food chain, and everybody else will probably be at or below poverty line. 1987, The Secret Constitution and the Need for Constitutional Change is sponsored in part by the Rockefeller Foundation, and author Arthur S. Miller says, a pervasive system of thought control exists in the United States. The citizenry is indoctrinated by employment of the mass media and the system of public education. People are told what to think. The old order is crumbling. Nationalism should be seen as a dangerous social disease. A new vision is required to plan and manage the future, a global vision that will transcend national boundaries and eliminate the poison of nationalistic solutions. A new constitution is necessary. Yeah, there we go. They're kicking it into gear here. December 7, 1988, in an address to the UN, Mikhail Gorbachev calls for mutual consensus. World progress is only possible through a search for universal human consensus as we move forward to a new world order. Yeah, Mikhail drank the Kool-Aid too. September 11, 1990, President Bush calls the Gulf War an opportunity for the New World Order. In an address to Congress entitled Toward a New World Order, Mr. Bush says, the crisis in the Persian Gulf offers a rare opportunity to move toward a historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, a new world order can emerge, in which the nations of the world, East and West, North and South, can prosper and live in harmony. Today, the new world order is struggling to be born. That was pretty much his downfall. I think it was after he had one of those speeches where he kept bringing this up that people started saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe he should not be getting a second term. What they got was worse. 1991, author Linda McCrae Campbell publishes How to Start a Revolution at Your School in the publication In Context. She promotes the use of change agents as self-acknowledged revolutionaries and co-conspirators. That's what our education system is. This is what they've been teaching these people when they become teachers. This is what you're seeing. And they're arrogant about it. They go on YouTube and on all these other goofy social media things and brag about how they're influencing kids in this way. Because this has been going on now for 30 years. This is what they were brought in for. And they bring in all the whacks and kooks and you know, flaming liberals to do it. And they just think that this is their calling. It's insane. 1991, President Bush's State of the Union message says, what is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order. I think this is the one that fried his beans. To achieve the universal aspirations of mankind based on shared principles and the rule of law, the illumination of 1,000 points of light. The winds of change are with us now. I wonder if that's where the Scorpions got the title for their song. But you know, here's the thing. Do you remember where we saw the points of light then? Going all the way back to the beginning, right? Annie Besant, right? The occultist. February 6, 1991, President Bush says, my vision of a new world order foresees a United Nations with revitalized peacekeeping function. I can't think of the kid's name, but there was one of the guys that got jammed up because he was in the U.S. Army and they decided to detach him to the United Nations Armed Forces, and he refused. You know, he wasn't going to wear that uniform. He wasn't going to serve under their headship and court-martial. His name is escaping me right now. But that kid, I'll tell you what, I got to give him a lot of credit. 1992, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, Earth Summit takes place in Rio de Janeiro this year, headed by Conference Secretary General Maurice Strong. The main products of this summit are the Biodiversity Treaty and Agenda 21, which the U.S. hesitates to sign because of opposition at home due to the threat to sovereignty and economics. The summit says the first world's wealth must be transferred to the third world. Clinton signed on for that. He came in after 1992. Actually, he came in right at 1992. So this probably was just ahead of his getting elected. And he signed executive orders to that end. And he actually, I think, at least something, either he signed it or he was going to sign it, where it would give the United Nations, as a result of the Agenda 21, the opportunity to tax American citizens to support this. They wanted to undo things like dams and stuff like that in places where streams were rerouted to make the land more usable because it was arable land, but they couldn't use it because it was swamp. So they redirected streams and stuff like that. They were going to force farmers to turn their land back to the old way, which would have made it, you know, basically useless, you know, for farming and the like. So this was a lot of that stuff. They were basically trying to set the world back to being almost like one big third world country. Kind of tough to feed people that way. That's another topic altogether. Matter of fact, maybe one of these times I'll bring the video in on the Georgia Guidestones, just because you can see there's a lot of stuff at work. July 20th, 1992, Time magazine publishes The Birth of the Global Nation by Strobe Talbott. Does that name sound familiar? He was an Obama guy. Rhodes Scholar, roommate of Bill Clinton at Oxford University, CFR director and trilateralist. Boy, he's just, you know, into the whole thing. He's locked in. All countries are basically social arrangements, no matter how permanent or even sacred they may seem at any one time. In fact, they are all artificial and temporary. Perhaps national sovereignty wasn't such a great idea after all, but it has taken the events in our own wondrous and terrible century to clinch the case for world government. September 29, 1992, trilateralist and former CFR President Winston Lord delivers a speech titled Changing Our Ways, America and the New World, in which he remarks, to a certain extent, we are going to have to yield some of our sovereignty, which will be controversial at home. Under the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, Americans are going to be hurt as low-wage jobs are taken away. That's open borders again. Yes, it did. July 18, 1993, Henry Kissinger writes concerning NAFTA, What Congress will have before it is not a conventional trade agreement, but the architecture of a new international system, a first step toward a new world order. So here you are, you know, they're just plowing away, 80 years into the mix from where we started. August 23rd, 1993, Christopher Hitchens, he's the angry atheist, socialist friend of Bill Clinton, says in a C-SPAN interview, it is, of course, the case that there is a ruling class in this country and that it has allies internationally. Those are the elitists. Those are the ones who are very upset right now because U.S. aid was taken away from them, and that was their cash cow. 1994, in a report published by the UN Development Program, there was a section called Global Governance for the 21st Century. The administrator was appointed by Bill Clinton. His name is James Gustav Speth. He said, mankind's problems can no longer be solved by national government. What is needed is a world government. This can best be achieved by strengthening the United Nations system. That's why they tried the League of Nations. It would have had another 30 years head start if they would have gotten that in place. 1995, the State of the World Forum sponsored by the Gorbachev Foundation in San Francisco. Foundation President Jim Garrison chairs the meeting of who's who from around the world, including Margaret Thatcher, Maurice Strong, George Bush, Mikhail Gorbachev, and others. Conversation centers around the oneness of mankind and the coming global government. However, the term global governance is now used in place of New World Order, since the latter has become a political liability, being a lightning rod for opponents of global government. Yeah, see, Bush was the one who cooked that phrase. 1996, the United Nations 420-page report, Our Global Neighborhood, is published. It outlines a plan for global governance. There's that word, they plugged it in quick, calling for an international conference on global governance in 1998 for the purpose of submitting to the world the necessary treaties and agreements for ratification by the year 2000. Yeah, that's, Reagan kind of screwed that up. Well, Bush kind of screwed that up too. And the U.S. wants to tax us too. United Nations delegates partying in Doha, Qatar are planning to impose a new kind of tax on Americans. UN conferees have been discussing how they can start a global tax that would hit Americans hard. The UN bureaucrats are not deterred by the fact that Americans should be protected by our U.S. Constitution. Their vehicle for this travesty is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There you go. This was their baby. This is their baby, and they're still pushing this hot and heavy. There is absolutely nothing scientifically that verifies anything that they say. And, any legitimate scientist who has spoken up about it has been quickly silenced. But, they're out there, and they still hold to the idea that this is utter nonsense. But it's there for a reason, because it's a way to extract money. And as Doge has been kicking into gear, and you see where it's all been going, the one that really cracked me up was Biden came up with a thing, and I'm sure he didn't, but he was putting out some untold amount of billions so that high-speed internet would be available to everybody. So I was watching somebody read all the qualifications and everything that you had to do in order to get it into place.
One person was connected.
Right, not one person was connected, because by the time they got done through all the bureaucratic nonsense, nobody could figure out how to get it done. And that money has disappeared
They
miraculously.
call this officially Paris Accords.
Oh, yeah,
And then when Trump got in, he escaped it. He opted out.
Yep.
When he got out, Biden put us right back in.
Yes, he did.
Trump took us right back out day one.
Yes, he did.
That's our tax to the United Nations, the Paris Accord.
Right. But you can see how far back it goes. Agenda 21 is a document called the Declaration on Environment and Development and the Statement of Principles for the Sustainable Management of Forests, and was signed by 178 governments, including President George H.W. Bush in Rio de Janeiro in June 1992. In 1995, President Bill Clinton followed up by an executive order that established a Presidential Council on Sustainable Development, giving globalist busybodies the excuse to work on it ever since. Agenda 21's goal is to save the planet and sustain life on Earth regardless of its adverse effect on human life and our standard of living. It is based on the very un-American notion that private property is a social injustice, since not everyone can build wealth from it. The purpose of this UN attack on property rights is to reduce the US standard of living to that of the rest of the world because the UN bureaucrats resent our prosperity. Here he is. Vice President Joe Biden calls for a new world order, April 6, 2013. Apparently, he was losing his mind even back then because he didn't get the memo that they don't call it the New World Order anymore, right? The affirmative task we have now, Biden said, is to create a new world order because the global order is changing again. And the institutions of the world worked so well in the post-World War II era for decades, they need to be strengthened and some need to be changed. Joe goes to the highest bidder. Biden continues. So we have to do what we do best. We have to lead. We have to update the global rules of the road. We have to do it in a way that maximizes benefits for everyone because obviously it's overwhelmingly in our interest. Really? It's our interest that China prosper, that nations big and large, east and west prosper. We have to level the playing field so that the companies and workers can compete in the world and that the competition is fair and it's healthy. So again, this is setting aside merit-based work because if you do well, you can't benefit from it. And this is the early form of DEI.
And let everybody tariff us and make money off of us.
So there's Satan's one world government. We could do more. We could do more. That's as far as I took it. That was 100 years worth, and obviously that was up until 2013. Just in the last 10, 12 years, there has been an abundance of things that have taken place that have continued down this path. And unfortunately, we're still living with that. And these people haven't gone away. They're still over there. All of these, the WEF and some of these other organizations and stuff like that, they're still sitting there picking away at this. They're not real happy with Trump. And why should they be? Because, yeah, I know. Well, and the World Health Organization, right? And it occurred to me more recently that when you think about this situation, and I didn't have it in here, I should have thought to include it, but when you think about this situation, they're trying to do away with national sovereignties, and they're trying to sidestep governments. And obviously, going back as far as we've seen, this was kind of part of the plan. But it's kind of hard to put into place because most people don't want to let go of that. Whether you're in a good country or a bad country, Canadians still don't want to be part of America. It's abrasive to them to be called the 51st state. And I think most of us understand that. In this country, we don't want to be, our sovereignty, taken away. And I'm sure that there's places in Europe, they've kind of softened that a little bit because they have opened their borders and they've welcomed the whole Islamic entity into their midst. And it's becoming pervasive now. And, since the European Union became the big thing there, most of those nations have set aside a certain amount of national sovereignty because of the union.
And now they're being overtaken.
Right.
Where they're going to be outpopulated by the asylum seekers.
Right.
In which turn they will now be good and voted in.
Right.
Into the political seats, and they will eradicate what's left of.
They are. They're already doing it. They're already doing it. In Britain, they literally are. They're taking over their government. And pretty soon it'll be under Sharia law. Probably in our lifetime. But so we see all that taking place. So, at the end of the day, it started to occur to me that it might not be a thing where you just have, nations that take over, where you have 10 nations, so to speak. What you may have are 10 entities. So maybe it is, an entity like the WHO, is one of the 10. The WEF is one of the 10. The Trilateral Commission type organization is one of the 10. So you don't have borders. You just have 10 entities that are dictating what everybody does under one person's headship. So these NGOs might be the thing, and they're kind of there nobody gives them much credence, but they get a lot of, and you see evidence of it even here. Look at the situation with Fauci, the deep state. You have people that have been in place and have been making decisions in this country for sometimes 30, 40, 50 years. They're not voted in, they're not accountable to anybody, and they just manage to keep sticking around through administration and administration and administration. Doesn't matter who the president is, or which faction of our government is in control. They just keep doing what they're doing. And what we see happening right now is he's dismantling that. And you can hear these people just screaming bloody murder because this has been my favorite AOC. He just doesn't know how things are done, talking about, Musk. No, he doesn't. He's looking at it and says, this is a mess and it needs to be cleaned up. There's a guy who knows a little something about efficiency.
As if she knows.
Well, but all she knows is that there's something in it for her.
Mhm.
All these people that you see selling out the
A
sovereignty.
millionaire overnight in 4 years.
Right. And that's just it. You're in office. The way our government works, once you're in there, all you got to do is play the game, and you'll stay there forever. How did Biden manage to stay in government for 50 years? Because he just went with whichever way the wind blew, and he was ingratiated for it. So the bottom line is, they know this. So it's what's going on. Why do you think he's tearing apart all this bureaucracy? Because just like the thing with the high-speed internet, you can't get through 8,000 layers of bureaucracy and expect to get anything done.
High-speed train in California never happened.
Yeah. I forget where it was that somebody was building.
Billions of dollars.
Somebody built an outdoor bathroom facility in a park or something like that, and they ended up spending like $1 billion on it.
That
really?
never got used.
Yeah, I don't think they ever completed it. But stuff like that. Where does this all go? And the problem is that there's a little bit of light that gets shown on it from time to time, and then people forget about it and they move on, and this just keeps running along in the background. And this is what it looks like. How many people paid attention to these politicians in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and in the 80s that were talking about doing away with your national sovereignty and giving over all of your authority to the United Nations?
So many people had the ability to listen to the speeches.
Well, that's just it. But I mean, and some of this comes back to our legacy media. They haven't been reporting on anything for a long, long time, because you would think anybody that was paying attention or had any real legitimate concern for what happens just in this country would have put that in the paper or on the news or said, hey, do you know what your politicians are saying? But they never did.
Just use critical thinking. Why do you think a celebrity that's on TV for 1 hour a day gets paid $10 million a year?
Because they're pushing an agenda.
For influencers.
Right.
They're not the news.
No, they're influencers, and people buy into it. There's more people that'll do whatever Taylor Swift tells them to do.
We're living in a psyop.
Mhm.
People that can't critical think don't understand that.
No.
It's intriguing.
Well, they can't, they've been dumbed down by their schools. They
And,
can't critically think.
So they're creating their own
And maybe
level of truth. This is why they don't want people in a Bible.
Look, I can tell you this right now, looking just through that, I can tell you exactly what happened to Paige.
Step by step.
Bring her down here. I'll do this just for her.
I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna send this to her. Gonna.
So anyhow, that's all I got for today. But you know me, I'll get started on something here again real soon. But let's pray. Lord, this is a difficult topic, and we recognize that it's a difficult topic, but we know that it's in the plan and it's in the works, and this is the direction that it's going. And what this should tell us more than anything else is that we cannot get comfortable with the things of this world. The things of this world hold nothing for us. And now we look beyond just the short period of time that we remain here. We have to look ahead to what's eternal. And therein lies the most important thing. This world is designed to draw us away from everything that belongs to God, that everything that God proposes or institutes or believes is true or proper. And we see that people are quick to buy into all of these things because they're worldly and they seek, pleasure, immediate pleasure and immediate satisfaction and immediate gratification. And all that being said is we have to recognize that we have to remove ourselves from these things. We have to seek after the things of God and move in that direction and away from all of the temptations that this world provides, because this world is destined for disaster. You've said so, you've written it, you've promised it, you've predicted it, and you are infallible and you are all knowing and you are never wrong. So I pray that anybody who hears this recognizes the importance of coming to Christ, because he promised us that we would know the truth and the truth would set us free. And I pray that that's what people draw from this, is that we need to be freed from all of this disinformation that's been put out there. There is one truth, it's God's truth. And if we follow after that, we don't need any of the rest of this. So I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.